So welcome everyone. I have a great guest on, Michael Leckie, who has I would consider a very varied background. There's some specific areas that I want to dive into. Our audience tends to be accounting and finance folks, which I think, and a lot of them tend to be at the executive level, which I think is kind of the sweet spot of the folks that you work with. So if you would, Michael, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and who the audience is that you serve the most.
Yeah. Well, that's sweet of you. Very background. I would have called it more of a checkered past, but we'll go with your term because it sounds a lot nicer. Yeah, I mean, my roles have generally been three kinds of roles in organizations. I've internal roles in the leadership or people leadership space, external roles in consulting across a broad variety of industries and focus areas, but a lot of them around strategy, change, and transformation, as well as just being a general a business leader and manager, running a P&L for a company like, Gartner at one point in my career. And I worked for, a lot of great companies, Bloomberg, General Electric, Gartner. And I've worked with, especially through my Gartner years and then my consulting after that, thousands of C-suite executives in different areas. What I do now is I work on helping organizations build change as a capability. And that involves a number of different things, but it generally always also gets down to a component, at least, if not a major component, which I suppose falls under the rubric of executive coaching, but it's really being that not only that thought partner, but that person who helps create the space between two people, so someone has a safe space to figure out what's really going on and what they want to do about it, and own those solutions and moving forward. So they're not subject to what I want, but creating the space that allows them to figure out what I want. So that's kind of in a nutshell, where I come from and what I do. I've been on my own now for about almost 4 years doing this and have some amazing clients and really enjoy what I do.
Awesome. So the way you and I got connected was a mutual connection, Mark Bowden. So some of you may have seen the episode that I did with Mark Bowden where we chatted about a lot of different things. And he mentioned you when I asked him about collaborations, because you and he had done quite a few collaborations. I'm curious,
Mhm.
what was it? So one of the things that I asked him about when I asked him, what does he look for when he is looking for people to collaborate with? One of the things that he said is that he looks basically for one thing, people who have what he doesn't. But also another thing he said I thought was interesting is people that have confidence around that, right? He's not really
Hmm.
interested in talking to people that are kind of on the fence and trying to play politician about all the different potential ways someone could look at something, but like someone that has a particular thing that they feel strongly about. And he talked about models, that you and he both use lots of models. And he mentioned
Hmm.
what you mentioned in the first chapter of your book, which is all models are wrong, but some models are useful.
Yeah.
Tell us what that means in the broader scale, and then let's talk a little bit about models.
Sure. I mean, that's a quote from George Box, introduced me by the person that actually introduced me to Mark, Michael Bungay Stanier. And what I love about it is the problem with models, right, is that they are a lens. They're a way of seeing the world around us, which can be useful, but it's not right. It's not accurate. It doesn't tell the whole story. And to illustrate that, any of you that have ever been inside an organization or somewhere else where they've made you or asked you to take some sort of, test that puts you in different colors or boxes or shapes or spheres or animals or whatever it is they do. One of the things is generally there's two reactions. One is, oh, that's really interesting. And two, but that doesn't define me. And so again, using a model is a way of looking at things that is helpful, but not the truth. And so it's sort of like using a map. Let's say I used to live just outside New York City. If someone was coming to town and saying, hey, I want to get around New York, I could draw them a map that here's the shape of an island, Empire State Building, here's where the World Trade Center was, there you go. It's not going to do them any good. There's not enough detail. And if I give them one that shows, okay, here's brick 1, brick 2, brick 3, watch out for the rat here, it's too much detail. It's not going to work. So what's that right elevation of that map? Model is the kind of same. You want to find the right elevation of model for the given situation that will allow you to make progress forward, to resolve something, but not to define what's truth and not to replace what is true. It's a useful thing to add into your toolbox. And so for Mark and I, one of the things that we do together, whether we collaborate on as business partners, is we actually have a service that we work with very senior leaders, generally Fortune 100 CEO or potential C-suite leaders, or people that, run private equity, hedge fund businesses. And we do a coaching program. It's 2-on-1, and we meet with them every week, and we're on call and available, and we work with them to create that space we talked about. Now, we're getting thrown into ambiguous situations all the time. They're like, well, this just happened. What do I do? And the instinct as a human being to help is to start giving them advice. So one of the things we use models for is to step back, ask some questions, and give a frame to what's going on, and say, does this frame seem useful? They're like, yeah, this is an interesting way to look at it. And then we'll use that model and the questions that that model gives us to help that person reframe the situation. Because oftentimes they're coming in asking the wrong question, but we don't know what the right question is because we weren't there. We don't have the detail. And so we leverage a model that we think, this one, that smells right. That seems kind of right. Let's try that and see where that goes. And if it doesn't, we move on to a different one. But very quickly, we're able to then find a way to use a model to help that person get that clarity, to see what's going on, to start to make some choices and feel less stuck. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So what that brought up for me is that coming from an accounting and finance background myself, I was very often working in situations where we were looking for the answer versus what I've heard you talk about before, looking for an answer. And it kind of made me think about like convergent thinking versus divergent thinking. And I think a lot of finance and
Right.
accounting folks oftentimes don't engage that much in the divergent thinking. Are there any tips that you can think of to help people that are more used to that convergent thinking kind of step back, get out of their way a little bit?
Yeah, John, it's a great question. And I think the first thing is to what you just illustrated is kind of know yourself. If that's the way that you think, and know if that's what your work requires, that it may require you to step into a bit of a different role. And I don't know if you have to do this all the time, but there's something I do with organizations. This happened to me. First happened to me way back. I joined a company that doesn't exist as such anymore, called Abitibi Price. It was a big Canadian newsprint company, the biggest newsprint company in the world. And now it's, I think, Resolute Group out of Montreal. They've gone through a few permutations as that industry's changed, but that's probably neither here nor there. What was interesting is that we had a problem with our sales and marketing group and our manufacturing group butting heads. Pretty classic. And so one of the things that we did is we took these people and paired them up. We made regions for sales and marketing that were roughly the region that was served by a physical manufacturing location, and put these people together, made them co-leaders. We shared them with what their compensation was. We adjusted their compensation. They made the exact same thing. We gave them one set of objectives. Half were focused on manufacturing, half on retail. And we said, you get paid the same in your bonus. So the two of you are tied at the hip now and everything. And one of the things that started to happen is we started to get into a conversation of what we called hats. And it's like, well, putting on my manufacturing hat, but putting on my sales hat. And so they would actually do this. And somebody at one point got like these different hats, but they would just use the motion and say, putting on this hat, hey, there you go. You've got all your hats, see? Exactly it. So what hat do you have to put on when you're, thinking about using those different models and want that divergent thinking? Maybe you just need that hat or need to have it up on your shelf to remind yourself there's times you want to put it on. But I can see you're way ahead of me on props. You beat me on that one.
Yeah, I promise you that was not staged. I just happen to use that metaphor a lot when we talk about communication.
It's a great
and
metaphor.
you hit on some, yeah, and the one though, so I have hats with different like departments, but what I sometimes ask people about that I'm curious to get your thoughts on are, what happens when their hat doesn't tell us anything, right? Like this tells me I'm an FP&A guy, right? I work in budgets and finance and all that. Okay, I kind of have a little bit of an idea. It kind of gets to your what you mentioned about we don't want to put people in boxes, but at the same time, those labels sometimes are helpful as a starting point to have a little bit of a contact. So what are some of the ways that we can, like, let's say we're going into a meeting and we don't know what hat they're coming in wearing. Do you have any, I know Mark's big on questions, any specific questions that you like to start with to kind of start getting some context for who that person is and where they're coming from?
Another great question. Well, one of my kind of heuristics, my rules of thumb is hide in plain sight. And so I'll just often start right up with that. say, hey, we haven't worked on this before. Tell me a little bit about your assumptions. What perspective you're coming from? What are you looking for from me? How do you want me to address this? And I will do that. I'll do so. Let me bring it back into what I do. I'll do that with clients. And one of the things I always do is I always start by creating a relationship that Ed Schein calls a process consultant, which basically means I'm going to create an interpersonal process between us that allows you to figure out what's going on. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to lead with those questions. You figure it out. You figure out what you want to do about it. But there are helping or consultative relationships that are more doctor-patient. I ask a bunch of questions, do a bit of a diagnosis, and then, we treat it either by you doing what I ask you to do, you're under my guidance, or I do something, to you with your permission. And there's also just the transactional kind of relationship was an expert one. You come to me and say, hey, how do I deal with this? And so, like, if I'm going to, if I have a plumber coming in because there's a problem with the toilet, I don't want the plumber saying, well, so how do you feel when the toilet overflows here? What is going on with you? It's like, no, just fix the toilet, right? So I'll oftentimes say to my client, are you looking for me to tell you what I think you should do here? Are you looking to have a conversation to figure it out? How would you like to approach this? And here's the pros and cons of those. And so I'll lay out potentially different hats I might be wearing and tell them why one might be more useful than the other. And I have had times where, although most of my work is that process work, where a client just says, how do I do X? And it's like, okay, I can tell you from my time as a human resources executive for a global company, you want to do this, not do that, and get the lawyers involved here. Boom, it's a simple answer. You just want to give it to them. So I think hiding in plain sight and, the words negotiating for the role you're going to play are way too long and involved for what you're doing. It's just like asking, what would be most useful? How can I be most useful? And then operating that way. And if it doesn't feel useful, then stop and saying, is this the most useful thing or should we try this? But making us all aware of what you just asked about for me is making us aware of the way we work, as opposed to we sit down, you start saying things, I start saying things, and we don't step back to say, how are we going to work together? Probably the number one mistake that organizations make across the world, which is we don't work on how we work. We just think, well, we're here because of who we are. We just need to get to it. But that's not true. We need to step back and establish how we're going to work together before the work can be done effectively, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, it makes sense. That reminds me of a challenge that I have pop up every once in a while. Is sometimes someone will ask me a question and the trainer in me wants to educate and tell them all the whys and the wherefores. Sometimes they want that, but sometimes they just want a quick answer, right? And because I'm a naturally curious person, I fall into that not observing the platinum rule. I like a lot of information, so I start giving a lot of information. I have to go, hold on, John. You tell people all the time about the platinum rule. You gotta use that yourself too. I just want you to tell them what to do in this particular situation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, hey, do you want the 1 minute answer, the 10-minute answer, or should we go to dinner here?
Yeah, and I'm guessing that could probably go back and forth with the same client, right? Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's
I would think so.
Yeah,
yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. So I noticed in your background that you were with Anderson Consulting. It wasn't really, well, I was going to say back in the day, but that's such a cliche. But am I getting the time frame right that was around the time that they were morphing into Accenture, or?
Yes and no. So I was with Arthur Andersen Business Consulting, which was started up by Arthur Andersen when Andersen Consulting spun out. And two things happened that were interesting during the time I was there. One, Andersen Consulting lost the right to the Andersen name and came up with this goofy Accenture term, which everybody panned and mocked and said, yeah, that'll never establish itself as a brand. And you've just given up $10 billion in brand value by losing the Andersen name. And then shortly after that, this little company called Enron came along and took the Andersen brand from highfalutin to zero, and the rest of the company with it. So yeah, interesting story about, side note about talking to people and doing interviews, not podcasts, but I got actually called by someone, I think from Reuters, the night after we'd done like a little bit of a rally for Arthur Andersen in New York, all the employees out there. Some guy got in our cards and they walked away. And that night I met a friend of mine from California, who was best man at my wedding, came in, went to a Chinese place and had a couple of martinis, and we're having a good time catching up. And I get this call on my cell phone Long story short, I then gave an interview without even thinking about it because I was young and stupid, and hung up. My friend said, "Who are you talking to?" I said, Reuters." He said, "You just gave an interview to a global news source after two martinis in the Chinese restaurant." I said, "I guess
Mhm.
so." He goes, shook his head. But the funny part was, is it came out actually. I looked pretty good, which is unusual. But my comments, it was about the resignation of the CEO. Joe had resigned at that day, and I was the first person they talked to, and so 12 companies around the globe carried my quotes as the inside source on Arthur Andersen about his departure, a man I'd met once in the hallway. So anyway, news sources.
Well, it kind of takes me back in the Wayback Machine. My first job out of college, I worked at a CPA firm, a degree in accounting, worked in a CPA firm. My first roommate out of college worked at Arthur Andersen.
Ah,
Um, and it was one of the, it was, I think back then they were the most conservative of all of the, at that time it was going from the big six. It was a big eight when I started, then it was the big six. And it was kind of going from six to four
yeah.
as I was reaching graduation. And I remember thinking, God, they're so conservative, so much so that he worked in the Miami office and they had multiple floors in the building they were in. And they had to put their suit jackets on, even if they went from floor to floor within the same building,
Yep.
right? And I always think about them when people talk about how accountants are not creative. And I always say, a lot of things in accounting, you really don't want people to do to be too creative. Those are the ones that usually end up in jail, do it because they do what we call Betty Crocker accounting, right?
Mm.
Which is that's no bueno. That's not a good thing. Um, but it's funny that the perception of them was they were one of the most conservative
Yeah.
and ended up
Yeah.
where they ended up.
And a great company. I'll tell you this, and to this day, and I've had the privilege of working for directly as an employee some great companies and working with, literally thousands of firms, especially in my Gartner days, advising, different CXOs. And Arthur Andersen, when I worked there, up until the time that it, disappeared because of Enron. Overall, I don't think I've ever worked for a more overtly ethical firm or a firm more concerned with ethics or doing the right thing. So it wasn't that the place was corrupt. I worked with organizations that I would trust far less than I would trust Arthur Andersen. But what the downfall, I think, is that there was also this culture that partners were kind of untouchable. And
Mm.
the ability to have a real honest conversation about how people were doing stopped at the bar above and below partner. You couldn't criticize another partner to a partner's face. And I think that's what protected the guy out in Texas, is that no one that saw what he was doing had an outlet to talk about it. It was a one small cultural flaw that took down a fabulous firm with some of the smartest, hardest working people I've ever worked with. I was looking forward to my next step was becoming a partner, and the penultimate conversation with my manager was, I put your partnership up and it's smooth sailing, and the ultimate one was, this Enron thing may be a bigger problem than we thought, and that was it. But it does go to show that a great company always still needs to be looking for its flaws and the things it needs to fix, because that one little Achilles heel was all it took for an amazing organization.
Yeah, I think the analogy that pops to mind immediately is our entire country, right? I think most Americans are still proud to be American, love their country, but it's not that hard to find one or two individuals that maybe are not the greatest representatives. They could end up, tarnishing something by the actions of one or just a few people.
Yeah.
And it's just something we have to constantly look out for. The guy that I was talking about that I was roommates with, that worked at Arthur Andersen, we became close when we were in college because he was one of the smarter guys in any of the classes that I had. And I was always trying to partner up with him to study for exams. So to your point, I unfortunately didn't have, I was a B student, but to get a job at the Big Four, you had to be pretty much a straight A student with,
Yeah.
all the extras back then. So I was a little bit jealous. I worked for a second tier firm that ended up being a great experience, but I still have fond memories of those days reading the book Big Eight and then all that transition. Um,
Yeah.
anyway, it's fun going in the Wayback Machine sometimes
It is.
with someone that has some shared context there. Kind of fast forwarding, something that you talk about uh, digital leadership.
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of content that you've put out on digital leadership, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on, since obviously a lot of people worked remotely and in hybrid situations way before COVID, but obviously when COVID hit and everybody went remote, and now we're kind of in a situation where there's a lot more virtual meetings and digital everything. Um, I'm curious what your thoughts are on things that people are doing that they're having success with to manage this sort of digital leadership with still having that sort of higher touch of being in the office and seeing people face to face.
Yeah, that's a great question, and people are trying to deal with it all over. I worked with a woman who has a small consulting firm called Sway, SWAY, does work in this space specifically, and I learned some great stuff from her. And if by the way, if this, and I won't get paid for it, but they're wonderful people and they have a great product, so you should check them out. But one of the things I really learned working with her was that it just ramps up the need for your own intentionality and kind of what I referred to maybe earlier as the social contract. Like, how do we need to work together? And I think what we're seeing, I mean, we're seeing a lot of things get mixed up in the work from home stuff that's happening. We're seeing some big companies pulling back from it. Now, it's interesting. It's not the first time we've seen this. We actually saw it happen pre-pandemic with Yahoo. And Yahoo got their new leader in, and she decided no more of this work from home thing. You got to come into the office. Now, I can't prove this, but it was kind of well covered in the press also that they were in financial trouble and needed to get rid of a lot of people. Well, it's a lot cheaper than paying a lot of severance if you just say, hey, we changed the policy and so sorry that you moved while the policy was out there, but that's not our problem. You got to get back to work. And now you can't. I guess you'll just have to quit. So I do think that there are organizations that are using this shift sometimes to their financial benefit, just in a bit of a cynical way. But there are also a lot of organizations, and most of them really trying to figure out how do we make this work. And one of the things that we do is we tend to say, well, we need to figure out how to make this work. Well, senior boss, what do you think? And now you put that up to the CEO, and she or he may have really thought this through, or she or he most likely is just going to respond with what they know best. And depending upon what age they're at, if they're above 40 or 50, they're probably going to say people need to be together, come to the office. And if they're below that, they're probably going to say, it might not really matter. I can work from anywhere. And they value these things differently, but we're not really going down and asking the people and the teams. And we're also concerned generally at a human resources level of, well, what's fair and equitable? Everybody comes in, nobody comes in. We have to be fair and equitable, which, fairness and equity are incredibly important, but they're also overused weapons in the weapons cache there of the human resources department because they're not always useful. I worked with and have a good friend who I believe still runs the university at PepsiCo, and it was really simple. He was talking about. He said, "Look, there are people who work at jobs like in technology that are just interfacing with zeros and ones all day. Why should they come into the office?" Now, until the trucks drive themselves, though, the people driving the trucks actually need to come in and sit in the truck and drive it from store to store. So there are jobs you just can't do remotely. And so I think that what I learned is you really need to have that conversation. What would be most effective? But then once you've made some decisions, you have to really communicate what you're doing and why. People have to buy in. And there are still some people that may opt out because all they want is that work from home job because that works so well for them, they now can't accommodate anything else in their life. But as you move up the ranks of the organization, you're going to need to be more flexible potentially, but you need to know why you're coming into work. And you need to know that a blanket policy just hasn't been applied to you as a number or as an FTE, but that they've thought about, well, what makes sense for John? What makes sense for Michael? And if they had any say in that, and then have they really worked through, if they're going to be away from the office, how do we get those connections? What's the best way to do it? If we're going to come together, what is the best way to do that and not waste time? Do I have to be there the whole time? Do I always have to be there? And I think when we solve it through dialogue, we get along a lot better. When we solve it through policy, we end up with policies that are made to fit everybody and fit no one. And the last thing I'll say about that is there's a great book called I'm gonna blank on the author, but it's called The End of Average, and I love it. He talks about when the U.S. Navy was looking at their airplanes for their naval aviators, and that they designed a seat for the average naval aviator, and they kind of hired within
Mhm.
this range. Now, the problem with it is it was based upon average height, average weight, average build, average bone length, all of these different things. But when they did the actual research, the amount of Navy pilots that were average was less than 0.1%. That people's
Wow.
bodies didn't grow average. And so they were having these crashes resulting in people, like, the ergonomics weren't quite right for split second decisions. And the simple solution was make these four components adjustable so people can seat themselves the way they need to. And the amount of crashes went down dramatically. But they have been building it to average, and the average doesn't really exist. Well, that's what we do with
Yeah.
policies. We create policies for the average employee. So basically, we create a policy that applies to no one effectively and think we've solved a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. You reminded me there was a guy I went to high school with who was at Civil Air Patrol and down the road to getting his requirements to get his private pilot's license in high school and wanted to join the Air Force and become a pilot, but he was too short to get in the
Yep.
pilot program, even though he had almost already qualified to be a private pilot, had the skills, had the aptitude, had the desire, but just for that one reason, he wasn't average, or he wasn't
Yeah.
within the average.
Yeah.
Um, the end of average. So I'm gonna have to definitely have to look that one up. I noticed that that word useful keeps coming up over and over and over again uh, in in the conversation, which is I'm glad that you're using it over and over again to remind me about it, because there's so many things I think, especially as organizations get bigger, the answer that used to drive me nuts when I worked at big Fortune 500 companies. When you say, "Well, why do we do it this way?" Well, that's the way we've always done it. That used to drive me nuts,
Yeah.
and I used to get in trouble because I'm the curious. I'm always asking questions. Sometimes you ask the wrong question of the wrong person, and find out that we do it that way because they're the one that came up with the way to do it. Now you get yourself into hot water. Um, but and I looked at jotted down another couple of notes here. Oh, FTE, I just wanted to clarify. I fall into this all the time with acronyms. For the non-accountants or finance folks out there, FTE, full-time equivalents. I've done interviews with military veterans, so I've gotten attuned to watching out for my own acronyms and lingo. So I try to help the audience out with that if they don't know the
Yeah.
acronyms sometimes. Um, there's something that you put out very recently. Actually, it was today, actually, where you were talking about asking the question, "How is my idea wrong?"
Ah.
And it reminded me, I have a lot of conversations. I have these two friends that I'm in a WhatsApp chat with. We've known each other since we were like 12 years old, right? And we argue all the time, but we've always had the ability to disagree without becoming disagreeable. And I feel like that's like a lost art. And this post that you made about how is my idea wrong reminded me of that. Can you talk a little bit about that question?
Yeah.
Because it's a
Yeah.
powerful question.
I'll do my commercial now. That's from the book, The Heart of Transformation. And that series, thank you, is one we're doing on just kind of taking the questions I use for building change as a capability and then just using them in everyday life. But how is my idea wrong is one of those questions that opens up so much, and especially important if you have power in the situation. You're the manager, the leader, the boss, the expert, whatever it may be. People are content to let sometimes the most powerful person or the loudest voice in the room be right, even if they don't think they are. It's a safer path because then it's their fault, sadly. And so opening up how is my idea wrong is one of those questions that first of all says, I'm fallible. I will make wrong choices, which I think as a leader is tremendously valuable to role model for people. They don't want a leader who's always right. They want a leader who's willing to work through and find out what is right and learn from the group as well. So how's my idea wrong starts to create some of that psychological safety to challenge the leaders that the ideas that the leader has. And it also starts to move you away from something that is insidious in corporate life just about everywhere, which you actually were referring to a moment ago, saying I find out that that decision was made by the person there and now I'm in trouble. Because we have this tendency to, although we don't say it out loud, to believe that I am my idea. I am identified with my idea, and if my idea is wrong, therefore I'm wrong. So my idea can't be wrong. And so one of the things I do when I'm working with groups, especially we're going to have potential conflict or differences. For example, I have a client now, in the midst of going through what's going to be a truly massive acquisition integration. And one of those things that we're going to be talking about is our wrong ideas, and that we are not our ideas, and say, let's put ideas forward. Our ideas are going to be very different because a different idea is very different from yours. And if it's the idea we go with, doesn't mean you're wrong as a person. I'll often say, and I'll say, this is not semantics. This is not consultant speak. I want you to really hear me. It's not that you're wrong. It's not even necessary that your idea is wrong. It's that it's no longer right. Generally, we make good decisions with the information we have and the time and the place that we are. And then somehow we think they're going to be evergreen. The world changes us around us completely, but somehow that idea should just last forever, like, the books of the Bible or something, but they don't. And so acknowledging that what was once a good or the better or best idea might not be because things have changed is really, really useful. And in the situation I'm in with this client, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that the situation is changing because you now have these two organizational cultures coming together. And, culture is one of the things that defines competence, right? Competence is defined in a culture and in a context. I can be in one organization and be incredibly competent, go to the new one and be incompetent in a sense, because I don't know how to work within that culture. And so I'm saying things that are derailing, taking my ideas out of play, making me be not listened to, all sorts of things. So we have to allow for the wrongness to figure out how we can actually be more right about things, and to invite more and more people into that dialogue, and not just have an organization that's run by someone with the most power. We used to call it, how are decisions made? And some would say we use the hippo approach, the highest paid person's opinion. That's the one we go with. And the hippo approach generally does not last for long. And it's unfortunate that it starts that way, but it comes because that person probably had some really good ideas, and they put them in that place of now all your ideas have to be the right ones, and their ego is caught up in it too. So that's where you end up, as opposed to them saying, hey, how is my idea wrong?
Yeah, so much came up for me there when I jotted down a bunch of notes here. But one of the biggest things was a lot of which we're talking about reminded me of some of the things that I've heard Ray Dalio talk about radical candor, and recording their meetings, and putting them out there for the world to see, examining different points of view. But one of the things that you said about this is not consultant speak, but it's not about your idea being wrong.
Yeah, it's about it being no longer right.
Being no longer right. Sometimes there are times that language distinctions sound cliche and trite because they're overused, but sometimes you really have to get the wording right because it makes a difference. And I think that's something that for me, especially when I'm doing training, I have to be careful to not use too many things that just sound cool and easy to remember, but maybe don't suit the purpose. Right?
Yeah.
Because people are used to seeing a lot of things. The classic one I see is that pie chart where they talk about 97% of communication or 93% of communication is nonverbal. Okay, well, I know one of Mark's partners in crime, Scott Rouse, has actually talked to Dr. Moravian, and they got that whole pie chart all messed up.
Yeah.
But boy, it sure sounds good.
Yeah.
And lots of other people with all kinds of, letters after their name have regurgitated that. And to a certain degree, it's useful, even though it's probably wrong, if you really want to get technical with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Yeah. Very true.
Another thing, go ahead.
No, I say it's just an interesting insight, and you're right. I mean, there are so many things that we just kind of parrot about it as if they're true, and the language piece is learning how to really communicate effectively. I give an example, something that happens. I work with a guy doing a project with him now named Bob Mesta. Bob has a little company called the Rewired Group, and Bob created jobs to be done theory with Clayton Christensen many years ago before Clay passed away. But what jobs to be done theory says is that a product or a service has a job it's doing for you, or you're making progress, overcoming a struggle, and until you know what job it's doing, you can't really understand how to market or improve or innovate and sell that product or service. And when he'll work with clients, what he will not allow them to do is to start to label the different jobs. Oh, that's the collaboration job. That's the, he says, no, 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 no. He goes, that's a corporate, huge corporate mistake where we've got, we call it, all due respect to my friends who work there, I love you. We call it, the Microsoft, fallacy, which is it's got to fit on a PowerPoint slide. So he says, no, if the job is 3 sentences long, use the 3 sentences and just get used to it. When you try and reduce it down to the word you think fits, that word may be the perfect word for you, but for this person, it means it's something entirely different. So oftentimes just being real clear about this is what this is doing, it's like, oh, okay, I get that, and resist the need to simplify it. I think that happens in our communications too. You run into this all the time. You could simplify things down into really cute little models and acronyms, but then it wouldn't really mean the same thing to other people. It would be all over the map on how they interpret it. So you have to take the time and use careful language. They understand, the nuance, because there are real nuances in how we relate and communicate as people that if we don't take the time to explore, we miss a lot in the pace of work today.
Yeah, that expression about all communication being context dependent. I think that's one of the things that I hang all of those hats on many times. My girlfriend and I often talk about the decoder ring that we need for each other.
Yes.
Right. She's very extroverted. I'm very introverted. I'm extremely literal, and she kind of talks more in bigger picture terms. And so every once in a while, I feel like, all right, where's my decoder ring? Because I know from how she said it that I'm not supposed to take it the way those words. I've got to decode this, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in personal relationships, I think we tend to make more of an effort, especially if it's like your significant other, because that the importance of that relationship is so high, and we're so invested in that most people tend to be willing. I should say most people. Lots of people tend to be willing to put more time into that, and that's one of the things I struggle with. I would feel like a salesman sometimes because I deal with accountants a lot, and communication skills are typically not at the top of their list of things they want to do training on.
Yeah.
And some of these examples, I've had people tell me, "Oh, I could use this in my personal life." Well, duh, it's just communication, right? People are people. We're
Yeah.
all wired with certain things out of the box, and we're all unique. Um, so something you said when you were talking earlier triggered something for me about decision making. And something you said reminded me of Annie Duke talks about the idea that she calls resulting, right? Where we'll judge the goodness of a decision based on the result. Right? So we make a decision and we don't decide whether that decision is good or bad until we see the outcome. And she uses lots of different examples, but the one that hits home for me is I think everyone could agree that driving drunk is a bad idea. But there are people that have driven drunk, they get home, nobody got hurt, and they go, huh, maybe I wasn't that drunk.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm actually pretty good driving when I'm drunk, right? I think we could all agree that's still a bad decision. But how many times in a business setting do we look at a result and it gets totally divorced from the quality of the decision? And what I learned from reading some of her stuff and listening to her talks is that so many of us don't have framework for even defining what a good decision is, or how do we make a decision in
Yeah.
the first place.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of heuristics and things that we use that we never examine. A lot of the stuff that things of yours that I've read or videos that I've watched triggered things for me where I was like, I got to think about that model maybe that I've used before that I haven't really examined. I used it because someone I thought was credible used that model, and so I just assumed that it was good. And it may be useful, but is it useful in this specific situation? Not exactly sure. Kind of
Yeah.
think about it in context. So a couple of things that you talked about touched on awareness. And that, what is my blind spot was another post that you had put out there. And I know there's not that I've not seen a lot of exercises um, for identifying our blind spots because by definition, there are things we don't know, right?
Right.
Um, what are some of the things that you do with clients to help them find blind spots other than you just pointing them out directly to them?
Yeah, well, I encourage them. I mean, obviously, that is part of what I do, but also to find those people because they are in your life. So I was having an exchange today with a gentleman named Dr. Chris Worley, who was my thesis advisor at Pepperdine at the MSOD, and teaches at Pepperdine and USC now still. A great guy, and one of the things that we learned in that program, which really made it stand out, was we had a branch of it that they called the self as instrument. And what the theory was that said, if you don't examine yourself and understand where your weaknesses and blind spots are, as a person in a helping role, like a consultant, you will not only not see, but potentially exacerbate that problem in your clients. So if your clients share your problem, you're going to make it worse for them. And that's bad. So we spent a lot of time doing just, traditional, group work, like we used to call a T group or whatever it may be, where you really give and receive feedback. But what it taught me is the value of having people in your life who will tell you the truth and who love you enough to give you feedback and give you things to think about. And so you have to find those people, you have to cherish them, and you have to cultivate them throughout your life. Now, I do some of that for my clients. That's part of my job. But you're right. I mean, I only have a handful of clients because there's only so many I can take on. I have so many hours in the day. And certainly there are probably some clients who need that help that I don't really want to take on either because they're not the right client for me. And you can't just count on the world of hired coaches to do this for you because, not everyone can pay for that. But everyone can find friends that they can build that relationship and say, hey, like your guys in the WhatsApp chat, they're probably some of your little brain trust who are, kind of telling you what they're really seeing and what your blind spots are. And I would imagine that two things, that it's not always pleasant, but you know where it's coming from and it's made you a better person. So we have to be willing to accept that our own growth and change is not always fun. You mentioned Ray Dalio from Bridgewater, and if you've read John Keegan and Lisa Leahy's book on an everyone culture, they talk about Bridgewater and a couple of other organizations. They have what they call these deliberately developmental cultures, and in those cultures, people have two experiences. One, this place makes me uncomfortable and puts me on the spot, and it hurts sometimes because I have to confront things in me that I'm not good at, that I don't want to see. And B, I'm so happy to be here, the growth I get and their dedication to my growth. And those are kind of unusual and rare organizations. Most of the time, our organizations are doing everything we can to avoid anything that looks like disruption, which means we just get stuck in one groove, and don't go anywhere. So I guess in short, I would say that there are always people around you, if you look for them, who are willing to tell you the truth and willing to hear the truth from you. Find them, care for them, cherish them, make it a compact. If you're independent like me, have a small group that you work with that does that for you. Have other people that coach you. I have a gentleman that used to work for me at Gartner, who turned out, after we put our coaching programs in place to be one of the best coaches we had. I meet with him once a month, just out of our friendship, and he coaches me. And I have other people that do that for me. I'm always seeking out my own coaching. Otherwise, I know I could fall into the trap and start to not see my blind spots. And I can tell you, when I see my blind spots, they suck. I hate seeing them. It's no fun. I don't like seeing that part of me. But, once I work past that and get past my own, sting to my ego and realize, yep, you're still a work in progress, Leckie, then it's okay. And I start to move forward. And I find that I've moved forward far enough that I can be of a lot of help to a lot of people. But, that will stop at some point if I don't keep growing myself.
Yeah, one of the things that has been really useful for me, but to your point, not always very comfortable, is watching these podcasts. It's been a good feedback tool for me
Yeah.
to catch bad habits and to just see things that I wouldn't otherwise see and hear things that I wouldn't otherwise hear. And I do all that stuff you're talking about too, but I didn't seek this out for that purpose. But when I started and I was doing the editing myself, working out the kinks of the process, I thought, oh, wow, I got to take some notes here on myself. Forget
Yeah.
about I've got all the stuff on the guest. We're we're good with that. I got to watch this a second time now. I almost feel like Mark and his partners in crime when they're watching the videos they break down on the behavior panel.
Yeah.
Only I don't have the good fortune to have four experts like that. I'm just watching it myself, and then hopefully when we get some more a bigger viewership, we'll start getting some more feedback from other folks as well.
What a great insight though, John, is to realize that just doing that and that one little tool that you're doing, for your business and for other purposes can give you that. And it's like we're in meetings and corporations all day and organizations, and when we're in that meeting, we are not looking at ourselves. We're looking at everybody else out there in the audience.
Yeah.
What are they thinking? What's going on? What's happening? And to have those people who afterwards will say, as you've asked them beforehand, let me tell you what I thought, or how did I come across? How did I strike you? It's funny. I've done that with so many of my clients when I was in a corporate role, like in a human resources or a people role, where I would say, look, I can't tell you what's going on with everyone else, but I can tell you my experience of you. And that's not always going to be pleasant to hear, but I'll tell it to you in a safe place, coming from a place of love here. And I'm not going to share it with anybody else. I'm just going to share it with you. And what's interesting is I've only actually had one person say no to that. One person is like, no, I don't want to hear any of that. And they were not the right client for me. And then they've gone on and done things. They're, the CEO of a company, and I'm sure they're, fairly adequate at it. But, most people are really, really, willing, if they feel it's safe. And if you come from a place of caring, that you can kind of, speak the truth and love to them. And as long as they know it's safe to hear it from you and you're not going to use it against them or make them feel inferior, they're really, really grateful for that. But, kudos to you for finding it just through the podcasting process. That's a great way to do it. And, it's funny, anybody could do that. Anybody could actually, just talk out loud if they wanted to on Zoom and, clip it and for free, look at it themselves and see how they come across the way they wanted to. It's an easy thing to do.
Yeah, when I have people ask me about it, I suggest there's a couple of different apps out there that I've used. There's one called Speakio, there's one called Orai. They're these AI apps that you can just talk into, and they'll give you all kinds of stats. They count your filler words, they give you feedback on your pace and all these different things. Those are really helpful, but this is just one extra. And the thing that I would encourage people to, and this goes for everybody, give yourself some grace. Because I've had people give me feedback that has left me in a quandary. This is a good example. One of the things I discovered that's helpful for me, I'm very, very curious. And I have a tendency, I used to interrupt people a lot more because I'm trying to ask a question. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write my questions down instead. And then I had a few people just trying to be helpful say, kind of distracting when I'm watching your podcast when you're writing notes. And I thought, oh gosh, should I change it? I thought, you know what? Give yourself a little grace. They're not the every person. I'm not the every person. It may be useful. It may be not for other people. I'm still working it out. It's not perfect. Everybody else out there, as you're hearing this feedback and going, oh, I didn't want to hear that, but it might be useful. Use it and then give yourself a break or whatever the thing was that you need to improve on.
I agree. I think that's great. And I think it also goes, I've done that same quandary. And I go back to that kind of hiding in plain sight. Like with some clients, I want to take some notes. And so I'll say, hey, by the way, if you hear the clicking or see me typing, I am only taking notes on things I want to remember for our conversation next time. I'm not, looking at, Sandra Bullock vacation photos, right? I mean, I'm doing this, but then say, oh, okay, I get that. And they'll understand it. Or to your point, say, one of the things I want to do is not interrupt, but you made me think some questions. I want to look at them and see if they're useful later. So I'll be writing them down. Then people are like, oh, I get that. That's totally cool. But sometimes we just forget just to have that simple, again, social contract up front. Here's what you'll see and here's what you can expect. And is that okay with you? Great. Then we're okay.
Yeah. And I've even made an effort, which again, I got feedback that this bothered somebody, but I actually make an effort to let people see me writing. Right? Because it's very different. You're talking and I'm looking down like this.
Right.
Versus you're talking and I'm kind of looking at you. I'm looking down and you can see my pen moving. And then I follow it up with a question. It connects the dots for people. So again, context. I want to go back in the Wayback Machine because we're getting up on the hour here and I want to respect your time. So my career has been very varied. So I started out as an accountant. And now I do training. I did some consulting in between. You have a very varied background as well. And something I'm always curious about is when you were a kid, I'm sure at some point when you were a kid, it may have changed 50 times like mine did. What did you want to be when you grew up?
Let's see. I mean, I always wanted to be a rock star, but that never happened. I thought I wanted to be an architect at first. I don't know why. I like drawing, I guess. And what's interesting is I actually settled fairly early, I thought, for someone college-wise, and was happy with my major. And I ended up getting an undergraduate degree in psychology and thought I'd go on and be a clinical psychologist and do therapy. And I wanted to do that the entire way through undergraduate until I got to my last semester and all of a sudden thought, I'm not sure I want to do that anymore. And I didn't know why. And then life just kind of unfolded and happened to me, since then. One of my children, he's 24 now, and he's working in nursing up at the University of Washington Hospital in Seattle. He said, "Well, how did you think through and plan out your career?" I said, "Think through and plan out my career. Where were you back in the day, buddy?" But I always wanted to do something though creative. I always wanted to do something that brought out kind of more of me. And I think I was a really, part of me was kind of a shy kid, and that's like I forced myself to do some things that got over my, sort of shyness and maybe kind of, diffidence. Like one of them was I signed up to try it out for a play in high school, which terrified me, and I got a tiny part in it, which terrified me. But I found that I loved it and went on to act in all the plays and got awarded, best actor my senior year, and went on and did theater in college as well, but decided that wasn't a career for me. But I always wanted to do something creative, and I guess the why it led to this in a sense is because I do get to be creative in helping people think through and solve problems, and I always wanted to have an impact. And I joked about saying I wanted to be a rock star, but I think I always had those. I loved music as a kid, and one of the things I love about what I do is I work with people who have really big jobs that impact tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, even just within the organization, not to mention the customers and clients that they touch. And so I feel like if I help these people who have these positions be even better, I can help more of them than I can be one. And quite frankly, if I'm the person in that role, I always need someone to help me and push me to be better and more. So that's the role that I want to play now, and still that creative place to say, how can we have the biggest impact? Whether the audience is applauding because that was a great riff, or because the organization is healthy because of the way that you treat people like human beings. It's all kind of about impact to me.
So yours, I find those dots really easy to connect, and what you wanted to be and what you ended up being. So one thing I am curious about though is you talked about being a psychologist and a counselor, therapist. I'm not sure what the right word would be. And I've heard Tony Robbins talk about the distinction between coaching and therapy.
Mm.
And there's some commonalities and some distinct differences. So what do you see as some of the really clear distinct differences in being a coach versus being a therapist or a counselor?
Yeah, I think two things. I think that therapy does a lot of looking back to see what was broken in order to understand how to move forward. I think that a lot of coaching assumes that you're a relatively whole person, and we're looking forward to what you can do differently with that wholeness. It's one of the reasons I say this tongue in cheek, but I don't coach sociopaths or psychopaths. At least not for long. I've certainly have some clients I think I would put into that category way back in the day, but I've gotten better at avoiding it. But because you really can't. That's the kind of person that really needs therapeutic help to go back and see what went wrong. So coaching is mostly for relatively healthy people. And relatively healthy people can greatly benefit from psychotherapy. I don't have any doubt about that. I've certainly one who's experienced it a couple times in my life and got great value out of it. But we're not looking for where it went wrong. We're assuming that it's all pretty much okay, and that what you've got is enough to work with to move you forward. So that's kind of how I see the major differences for me in working with my clients. Doesn't mean that I haven't had conversations. I had one with a client in the last year where we ended up driving one day for about 7 hours. And I had them tell me about their life, their childhood, their experiences with their family, their experiences with death. I didn't then make a diagnosis and say, here's who you are. I just listened to that, and it gave me context for why they want to do what they want to do and what they accomplish. So I guess the last piece is I don't have to know that much about you to be an effective coach. I have to create a space that you can figure out more about you. I probably need to know a little bit more about you and be able to put you into some sort of model or diagnosis to be able to work with you effectively as a therapist. And the last thing I'll say is I've watched Tony for years. I had the pleasure of meeting and working with him when I was at Gartner. Um, Fascinating guy to watch, and he really does. As I realized over the years, a lot of the things that I do, he stumbled onto some of these things so very early, and the power of creating a space for you to step into and encouraging and pulling you into that space, using his charisma and everything else. But he's really good at that. But and he fires off things people listen to, but most of the time that people go to see him, that they feel something, is because he creates an extraordinary space in a big public area that allows people to step out. It allows them to give themselves permission to step out of who they are.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I do is that on a much, much smaller scale, but I think that's what effective coaching is all about.
Yeah, his coaching program solidified an opinion that I had for a long time, which is I'm much more a fan of showing rather than telling. And his entire coaching program is a combination of videos of him actually coaching people live, and then his partner Chloe Madonna breaking down, okay, when Tony said this is what was going on there. When he asked, and she kind of, it's almost like what Mark and his partners in crime do on the behavior panel. You get
Yeah.
the little clip, and then you get the expert breaking down what was going on there, and then you watch the clip back and you go, it's like magic, like watching
Yeah.
a magic trick. Only they pulled the curtain back. This is pretty cool.
Yeah, because human behaviors are, uh, very mysterious and yet still understandable in many ways. And again, that's what the models are good for. Say, is this a good model or good lens that helps me see something a little bit differently? And more importantly, though, it's so much less about do I see what's going on? Does it give me an opportunity for me to behave differently and see if that changes the dynamic? Because in the end, all I can do is self-manage my own behavior. I can't change you. I can't change Mark Bowden. I can't change anybody else's behavior, but I can identify what I'm doing and self-manage my behavior, and people will respond differently when I'm different. And so that can end up impacting the pair of you, the group, the whole organizational system, if you will, but it's by your change. And this is the thing that, and I do my change work, that most leaders struggle with. And there's a great series of questions. I believe they came from Ed Schein back in the day. Unless they came from Peter Block, I could be wrong. I should know this, but he said there's kind of three questions I always ask my clients. One is, okay, you've come in for this problem. Is it okay if I look around, ask some questions, see if I can figure out what the problem is? And they're like, well, yeah, that's what I'm hiring you for. Okay, is it okay once I think I figured out what it is if I tell you what I think the problem is? Like, yes, that would be useful. That's what we're hiring you for. Great. Is it okay if I tell you if you're a part of the problem? And he said, the first two, you get a good answer. The third one, that's the tricky one. And he said, and if they hesitate, I generally just don't take the work, because they're not going to be able to make a change because they're not willing to see that they may be contributing to the problem, when if they're the leader of the organization, for better or for worse, they always are in some way. And the key to the change is going to be found with them, in them changing some of their own behaviors and seeing the organization respond given their position, power, authority, relationships, etc., as opposed to changing others. When change is all about somebody else, ain't no change happening.
Yeah, for some reason that triggered the dog whisperer, Cesar Millan. He's got an expression about that. I train people, I rehabilitate dogs. And he says it's almost always in that relationship, the person is the leader.
Yeah.
Right. And almost always the dog's behavior, they're following the leadership of the person. And the person is always going, can you fix my dog?
Yeah.
And he's going, let me watch you for, he puts them through their paces and he kind of diagnoses. But that's always the uncomfortable conversation that he has to have is,
Yep.
You're actually the root of the problem. And then he'll break it down. And there have been some, I used to watch his show a lot. There have been some where the person said, no, it's the dog. And they just kept insisting it was the dog. And at some point he was like, I can't help you.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
If you keep going to the same drama day in day out, no matter where you go, it's the same drama, and everyone else is playing the same character. You got to start thinking, is it really that coincidental that everywhere I go, everyone's the same, or is some of this about me?
yeah, yeah. There's an expression. I'm trying to think of how to say it without cursing, but it was something about you're walking around thinking everybody's a jackass.
Yeah,
Maybe you need to look in the mirror and check your ears,
yeah, that's right.
right? What's the
That's
common
right.
thread here? What's the common thread with all this? Yeah. Let's wrap up with tell us a little bit about your book, where people can find it, and
Sure.
what's a core message that we can leave people with about the book, and then where they can find it.
Oh, okay. Well, The Heart of Transformation, build the human capabilities that change organizations for good. You can find it on Amazon.com. You can certainly find it at my website, which is Michael Leckie, MichaelLeckie.com. And I really wrote the book because one of my things I mentioned earlier is as I want to be able to have an impact. And before we did this podcast today, I mentioned you I was actually on with Mark Bowden, and we were basically taking questions we've gotten from people and sharing them with a broader audience and recording some videos around, look, here's, you can't quite frankly probably find and afford us unless, you are a C-suite leader at a major corporation. You're probably not going to engage us to solve your day-to-day problems because we work with a handful of clients and we're not inexpensive to work with. But we can take that learning and apply it to questions that you have no matter where you are. And so what I tried to do with the book was really say, look, when I've worked with organization after organization and they're stuck trying to change, it wasn't because they didn't have the technology and it wasn't because they didn't have the process. It's because of the people. But it wasn't that people were getting in the way or resistant. It's just that people don't have built in really the capacity to change. It's not natural. We crave consistency and solidity and predictability. And there's things about us as the way we've just, evolved that don't make us change animals. And so it's a bit of an unnatural act, but there's really easy ways to actually build it as a capability. And one of the best ways is through introducing new behaviors in the forms of questions that we don't always ask. And so if we introduce these questions, the behaviors of asking, listening, answering the questions, with a thing like, when was the last time I was wrong, right? What am I assuming to be true? Questions like that can open up a dialogue that can really get deep and really go far. And once we're used to putting the uncomfortable or the more challenging question out there and having the conversation, then we can form, reform, reorganize, and get things done. So, I guess what I would say about the book is that if you have any kind of interest in change, whether just seeing it happen in your organization, not even if you're not, someone who leads learning and development or change or is a senior leader, anyone can pick it up and learn some questions and techniques and ways of looking at the world, and quite frankly, some models that are very useful. What I wrote it to be is to be a very useful book, and that's what I hope it is. And we do a lot of things, online supplements to it now for a lot of people. So, but if you're interested in kind of, where I come from and, kind of encapsulates in a good place that's easy to access, what I've learned over the years, then The Heart of Transformation is a great book to pick up.
Great place to start. Lots of things that you out there listening or watching could learn. And the book, I think, is the natural first place to start. Michael, I want to thank you very much for your time. I could talk to you all day. I've still got lots more questions I'd love to ask you. Maybe if you'd be kind enough to come back on, we can continue the conversation because I love talking to you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd be delighted if you're, watching this, respond to, John, with your comments and thoughts, and maybe we'll use those as a foundation for another one. But it's always a pleasure to be asked great questions by somebody thoughtful who could probably fill the podcast with answering them themselves. So I enjoyed it, and I would look forward to doing it again.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right.
All
We'll
right.
see you guys next time.